Today we're going to be doing a fun Valentine's Day art project. I'm going to create some heart-shaped artwork for my sweetheart, and you can follow along here if you're going to make something for your sweetheart or lover. I'm going to be using Corel Painter 2021 and Rebelle 4 to create this artwork, so let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to start in Corel Painter 2021. Because I want this to fit nicely on screen, I'm just going to make this 1920 by 1920 pixels, but you can choose whatever size you want. I'm going to start painting on a layer. And for my color profile, I'm going to choose Adobe RGB. I'll click on OK. Now, if you don't happen to own Corel Painter or Rebelle, you could probably follow along using other art applications as well. The first thing we want to do here is just create a heart shape. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You could freehand draw a heart, or if you wanted to, you could go into a vector application like Adobe Illustrator and create a heart that way. Shoot, you could probably even find a heart-shaped glyph in Photoshop or through a web search. But because this is an art tutorial, let's take a look at how to draw one. On that new layer I created, I'll just name it Heart. And then I want to do a couple of things here. The first is I want to go to my mirror painting tool here in the toolbar. And when I click on that, it creates a symmetry plane. And if I were to select a brush like the Scratchboard tool, you could find this in the Artist Favorites category, but I have a custom version of it here. If I select black and I draw on one side of the line, it's mirrored on the other side. So just to give you a quick idea here, we could draw a heart like this. Now, if you wanted, you could just freehand draw it like this if you're good at freehand drawing. If you're not good at freehand drawing, here's a couple of different things you could do. One is you can increase the damping, and when you do this, it's going to make your strokes slower, so you'll be able to draw a smoother line. Another thing you could do is use a guide to get the shape and proportion correct. Here in Corel Painter, I'm going to locate the Divine Proportion panel. That's found in the Window menu under Composition Panels. I'm going to enable Divine Proportion, and then I'm going to click on this mode here, Portrait Top Left. If you happen to be left-handed, you may want to choose Portrait Top Right. This gives us a golden rectangle and a golden spiral, which we can use to create our heart shape. In order to move this guide around, we need to locate the Divine Proportion tool, which is hiding under the perspective guides. That'll let us drag this around. Let's resize it a bit, approximately the size of the heart that we want. And let's move it so the left edge lines up with this center line here for our mirror painting. If you chose the Portrait Top Right mode, then of course you'd want to line it up on the other side. You can almost start to see that heart shape already. So if I go back to my Scratchboard tool, and I make a decent sized brush here so I can get a nice smooth line, then I can draw and simply follow that curve. Now that gives me a nice perfect curve here. This is aesthetically pleasing. That means it looks better than if I mess it up and I do something like that or like this. It just doesn't look good. So you want to start here and just follow this as best you can. Now the faster you do it, the better it's going to look. And it doesn't have to line up exactly, but you just want to follow that general curve. And when you get to here, where you see this red line, then you want to follow the red line and just kind of come down to a sharp point. So if you can do that all as one stroke, then you'll get a pretty decent looking heart. And we want this to look hand-drawn, so it doesn't have to be perfect. It can stray away a bit. Once you've done something like that, you can switch to the paint bucket and just click in the middle to fill it in. Then we'll hide Divine Proportion. And we'll switch to the eraser, make sure it's fully opaque here, and without using too big of a brush, just kind of shave this off, whittle it down to a nice point here. Now we can turn Divine Proportion back on, and if you want to, you can use the distortion brushes such as Distorto, Bulge, and Pinch to correct this shape a bit. I'll go to Pinch, and with a decent sized brush, I want to just paint right along the edge of that black, and I want to kind of pull it into the shape that I want it to be. So pinch is pinching the pixels together into a singular point. So I'm just kind of sculpting this. I want to stay away from these corners here because if I pinch those, I'm going to mess them up. I only want to focus on the curves. I'm still painting with symmetry, so what I do on one side is going to be reflected on the other. I can hide Divine Proportion. That might help me see the edges better. Now it's okay if this looks a little bit rough and a little bit irregular. Again, I want this to look handmade. I don't want it to look like a clip art heart. So it can be a little wobbly, you could make it jagged if you want to, or you can smooth it out. The longer the line that you create, the smoother the curve is going to be, so I can really smooth it out like this. Just do what feels right for you. Once you have a nice heart shape, you can start to elaborate more on that and make it your own. You could change the taper here at the bottom. You could switch to the Distorto brush, and then turn off mirror painting mode up here in the stroke options. Maybe nudge that over like that. Pull it down and create kind of a drippy point like this. And then again, you could go back to pinch and you could smooth that out. I think something like that looks good. You could even just kind of make it a little bit less symmetrical. So now I don't have mirror painting enabled, so if I paint, this is only happening on one side of the heart. Another thing you might want to do is transform this. So I'm going to go to Edit, Free Transform. And the first thing I'll do is I'll grab one of these sides here and I'll pull it inward while holding Alt on my keyboard. And if I want to, I can kind of slim it out and compress it. I can also go to the rotate mode and I can rotate it a bit. And there we go, we have a pretty good looking heart. You could also make it smaller if it takes up too much of your canvas. You want to make sure that you hold down Shift and Alt at the same time. Then you'll be able to scale it from the center without squishing or squashing the proportions. I think something like that looks good. You probably want to avoid making your heart larger because that's going to make it blurrier, but a little bit of enlargement should be okay. Once we're happy with this, we'll go to Save As. I'm going to save this in a folder called Valentine's Heart. And I'll just call this Valentine's Heart Shape and save it as a PSD. Now, if you don't have Rebelle, you can download the free trial, or you can try to follow along in Corel Painter using a different set of brushes to get something similar to what I'm going to create. Here in Rebelle, I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'll open that Valentine's Heart shape. That opens as a PSD. You could feel free to change your paper texture here. I'm going to go with a watercolor paper like this. You can see my heart appears on a layer here. I'm going to designate this layer as my masking fluid layer. Then I'll create a layer beneath it, and I'll call it Paint. I'm going to designate this layer as my influenced layer. Then I'm going to hide the heart. I'm going to select a watercolor brush. Let's just say flat for now. And if I paint, you can see that my paint only appears outside of that heart silhouette. If I let the paint diffuse, then you can see it collects along the edges. So it's sort of like I'm creating masking fluid by using this layer. Now, if you wanted to, you could invert this effect and you could be painting inside of the heart, but we're going to do it this way. If you're following along in another application, you may be able to use a selection to create a similar stenciling effect. So I'm going to undo to before I put down that paint. Just so I can see what I'm doing, rather than completely hiding the heart layer here, I'm just going to turn the opacity down really far. I might make it a bit more opaque so that you can see it. And I'll go ahead and go back to that paint layer. You could also use stencils for this if you're more comfortable with the stencils function. But let's go ahead and add some paint. Now, if you want drippy paint, you'll want to go to the tilt panel here, and you'll want to click on this dot to make sure that tilt is enabled, and then just drag down. If you drag all the way down to the bottom, that's going to be an extreme tilt. The paper's vertical, and so the paint's going to run straight down. If you want it to be a little less angled, then you can make this line shorter. Or if you don't want there to be any tilt, then of course you want to remove that line, or just click on the dot. So we're going to have a lot of tilt here. We're going to pick some Valentine's Day colors. I've configured my color picker a bit here using these settings. I'm going to go with a magenta color like this. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to choose the Splatter 5 brush, and I'll splatter in some of that like so. We'll let the paint diffuse a bit. And I'll select this purplish color here and we'll put in some of that, maybe make it a bit darker. This time I'm going to add a lot of water. I'm going to tilt my pen as I'm spraying this out, and that will change the direction that the paint is spraying. Now we really have some drippy paint here. Now at any time you can dry that layer. So we can fast dry it here to fast dry those drips. That way they don't go all the way down to the bottom. Let's put in some more magenta colors here. Again, I'm trying to spray it outward, and we'll let that drip down, and we'll fast dry it before the drips get all the way down to the bottom. So that's one effect, but I want to show you another way that we could do this. I'm going to hide that paint layer. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to make sure to designate that as an influence layer. And with the same brush and these same settings, I'm going to create a big glob of paint. Then I'm going to select the blow tool, and I'm going to pull that paint down to pull it out like this. Then I will fast dry it, switch back to my brush, and I'm going to change my tilt angle up like this. Put another blob here. I'm going to blow that out like this. Fast dry it again, and I'm just going to keep repeating that process. I'm using B on my keyboard just to make it faster to get to my brush tool here. And then O for my blow tool. I'll need to undo. I forgot to change the angle of my paint. So I'll do a few undos here. Change the tilt to the right angle there. Back to my brush tool. Back to O to blow that. And I'll blow that out like so. And then fast dry, which you can do with F. Now I'll select a different color. Let's say a purplish color. We'll put in some of that using the same technique. And don't be afraid to overlap some of that magenta color a bit. We want these colors to run together. Don't forget to change your angle. And let's put in some reddish color too. That might look nice. Now if we want to create some thicker drips, we can go to the Visual Settings panel, which can be found in the Window menu. And under Watercolor Behavior, here we have the drip size and length. So we can increase that to 10. Now when we create some drips, they'll be much thicker. And we'll do a few of those thick like that and fast dry it. We'll have a few up here too at the top. We'll do that magenta color, have that coming down over here. And I'm just kind of picking this by whatever looks and feels right for me. We'll do some of that purplish color and maybe make it a bit more violet. And let's lower our drip size a bit so we can create something that's just a bit smaller. Do a little more magenta here and there, wherever we think it needs to be thickened up. If you want to be able to visualize the wetness as it flows, you can hit the H key on your keyboard. And here you can put in your paint and you can really see it go. You can actually see the wetness in addition to the paint. Do a little bit more on top. Now if we hide this heart, you can see what we have so far. I'm going to go to File, Save As. I'll just call this Valentine's Heart Shape Colored. And we can go to this heart layer and we can disable the masking fluid mode. Back to this layer 1, which we'll call Blow since we blew the paint around. I'll select white this time, and I'll paint with white right along the edge here. I'll try to tilt my pen so the paint fans out. And we'll go over it a few times here. This is just putting down some white wet paint just to make that edge not so sharp and perfect. And you can see the paint diffuse a bit there. Now you may want to fast dry that before it bleeds out too fast, so I'm going to undo and just fast dry it. And you can add a little bit more until you get something that you want, but don't let it bleed out too much. If you wanted to keep it speckled like that, you could just fast dry it right like that too. And you don't want to ruin that heart shape, so make sure it still looks like a heart. Now let's create another new layer. We'll continue using that splatter brush. I'll select a really light version of one of these pinkish colors, and I'll just go right along the edges to create sort of a vignette like this. I'm going to set the blending mode of that layer to multiply. I'll do a little bit of violet color too, just tap in a few little sprinkles here and there. If you overpaint it onto your heart, you can select the eraser and then just erase some of that. It's okay if it spills over a bit. I think that looks good. Let's go ahead and name this layer Splatter so we know what it is. Let's create another new layer. I'll name this Texture. And let's switch to our oils this time. I'm going to select the fan brush. And just to see what this brush looks like, I'll select a purple color. Now what I want to do here is select white and then just paint in here to create some texture. You might not be able to see what I'm doing very well because I'm painting white on white. But what I'm doing is just trying to fill this in without accidentally painting over any of the edges. Now if I go to the oils and acrylics behavior, I can increase the impasto depth. And I'll select a light purple like this, go back to the watercolor, turn tilt back on and have it tilt down. I'll select the Splatter 5 brush again, and I'll put some splatter over the top of that. And I'll fast dry it, select some other colors and just tap in a few of those, let it diffuse a bit, and then fast dry it, use a little bit of pinkish color. And what this is doing is the wet paint is flowing into that thicker paint and it's creating some really unique patterns. We're going to need to let this diffuse for quite a while. As you might recall, I used that fan brush and you can see some of those fan bristle shapes and the watercolor paint is flowing in between those bristle shapes. Now because this texture is on a separate layer, you can reduce the opacity of it if you find that it's too strong and you want it to be just a subtle tint like this, or you can have it be stronger. I'm going to turn off my tilt and I'm just going to go right along the edge here just to clean up some of that area that's a bit too white. And I'll go a little bit lighter with that color. But see how you can get these really interesting patterns that happen just all on their own? Now that thick paint that you added earlier might show up, and you may or may not like the results you get from it. In this case, it's created these little grains. I can reduce the glossiness of those grains to make them flatter, or just reduce the height of that depth altogether. I think a little bit of imperfection looks nice because it gives a little bit of texture to everything else. So we'll go with something like that. We can also increase or decrease the paper visibility, as well as the paint texture globally. We can also play with the various blend modes here to control how these layers interact with each other. Setting them all to multiply will ensure that they blend as watercolor should. If you wanted something more like gouache that's more opaque, then of course you'd want to set the blend mode to normal. I think I'm pretty happy with how this looks, so I'm going to go to File, Save As. I'll just call this Valentine's Heart-Shaped Colored Final. In order to have this printed, you'll want to save it as whichever format your printer suggests. You can do that under Save As, and then choose PNG, JPEG, or whatever. Although if you were going to print, you would have wanted to size your canvas to that print size before you started. I hope you enjoyed this art tutorial and you have a great Valentine's Day. If you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe and check out some of my courses and tutorials for Corel Painter and Rebelle. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.